With Europe falling into an economic crisis due to Black Monday, people were afraid that Deutsch Mittelafrika would be exploited to counter Germany's economic loss. Göring had a difficult task at hand, as he needed to assure the Kaiser that he could count on his help, but also ensure that his own ruling state would not go bankrupt as well. He aimed at fiscal austerity, which would increase both construction speed and factory output. As a result, Hermann von Göring's political support grew substantially. As King Edward VIII had agreed with the delegate from Australasia to focus more on research, mechanical computing was next on the agenda of researchers that were to be done. This would radically change what sort of machine-assisted calculations could be made. The war between the Emirates fell in the favor of Najd, that was able to dig deep into the territory of their enemy. Jabal Shammar paid in dear blood for their war declaration, as they did not seem able to keep up. The 1936 Stanley Cup came to its finals, creating some much-needed distraction for the stressed-out citizens from multiple countries. The Detroit Red Wings would face off against the Toronto Maple Leafs. The winner would be the 1936 NHL champions and would receive the Stanley Cup. Many people rooted for the Americans, as they hoped a win would cause a temporary depletion in their country's turmoil. Shortly after, Bishop addressed the king and demanded that more money and manpower be spent on modernizing the Air Force. He had a detailed plan, and it seemed like it could work, but would take resources from other projects. Edward dismissed this demand and said that Canada would remain on its current course following His Majesty's lead. In Mongolia, things were stirring, as preparations were made to make grounded claims on certain territory, arguing it was for the sake of a Mongolian minority in that area. It was something that would clearly be considered an act of war by neighboring Maklik. The Stanley Cup was won by Canada. Toronto had beat Detroit in a 4-game series, bringing the team their 4th victory in the finals. The French Republic's government was in the process of keeping Philippe Pétain situated on their main seat. With the economic crisis and a government in exile, there were radicals and many more who thought they knew how to do a better job of governing a country. But officials were afraid it would throw the French Republic in a time of utter chaos and possibly even civil war. Though the construction of factories could be seen as a marvel of prosperity for a country, King Edward came up with the idea of creating a large highway through its own country. Construction would not change much in the coming years, but means of travel would. The highway would need a proper name once it would be done, something royal and stout, signifying that this road would be like the unbreakable backbone of the country. In Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm reached out to the youth. The common folk were losing faith in its leaders, and Wilhelm realized he lost connection to some of those affiliated with him for many decades. Thus, he wanted to reform his image to the youth in order to gain more support and manpower were the situation to turn out violent. Then news arrived of a political change. Influential figure in pre-revolutionary Britain's politics and longtime Prime Minister of British government in exile Stanley Baldwin resigned from his mostly ceremonial office after the meeting with His Majesty, in which Edward VIII notified the Prime Minister of his intentions to marry his mistress, Princess Isabel of Orleans. While it is true that the Prime Minister opposed the idea of marriage on the ground of religions of king's love interest, and the fact that His Majesty's father did not agree to his son's marriage with the princess back in 1930 after the death of her first husband, sources close to the royal court indicate that the real reason of resignation lay in the new king ignoring Mr. Baldwin's advice in favor of Winston Churchill and Lord Beaverbrook, formerly ministers in Lord Curzon's government. Edward VIII accepted the resignation, and later that day appointed Lord Beaverbrook as new Prime Minister of government in exile. Then on the 3rd of May, the inevitable clash in the east occurred, as Maklik could no longer sit at the sidelines. The truth was that they were now being portrayed as the bad guy, as Maklik was the nation that declared war first, but the hand they got dealt left them with no other choice. As they feared, they were now at war with both Mongolia and Tibet, meaning a multiple frontline offense would be taken. As this war had just begun, the war between the Emirates was still going on. Najd was still the nation leading in the conflict, but they were not dominating as much as anticipated. The war had already claimed more than 5,000 lives, with Jabal Shammar suffering a startling 4,000. Canada's road to modernization ever so continued, as Edward greenlit concentrated industry at the same time as the build of the first highway. Maclique started out aggressively in their fresh war. They managed to head deeper into both enemy countries' territory, but it came at a high cost. Both Tibet and Mongolia had relative ease to defend and rack up the casualties of neighboring Maclique. And chaos continued to reign in Asia as a revolution in Siam occurred. A successful revolution was achieved by a clique of officers who called themselves Kana Ratsudon, meaning the People's Party. The heir to the throne and the chief of police were placed under arrest, and the king, who was not in Bangkok when the coup was carried out, returned to the capital and accepted the situation he was in. This upheaval in Siam was evidently a political expression of the malaise produced by the pressure of the economic crisis, as they tried to move themselves from absolute monarchy towards self-government. It was unknown whether after securing a parliamentary constitution, the provisional government would prosper or devolve into a dictatorship. After the British Revolution collapsed the American economy, upstate New York and the states east of it reorientated towards Canada to preserve their economies. Too conservative for syndicalism, but too moderate for America First, New England had become isolated from the rest of the United States and was now effectively in Ottawa's sphere of influence. Joseph Kennedy, representing the political and business elite of the regions, quietly informed everyone today that should the worst come to pass and the government in Washington prove unable to defend them, the state governments would allow Canadian troops to garrison in them. Then halfway through June, the Trade Union Congress in Britain had finally occurred. It turned out to be decisive. Longtime chairman of the TUC, Philip Snowden, declared his resignation, causing the four major factions in the Union, Maximists, Autonomists, Federationists, and Congregationists, to butt heads over the position. And as the dust settled, Welsh poet and leader of the Autonomists, Nicholas E. Gleis, had been sworn in as the new chairman. The Autonomists supported further decentralization of the Union of Britain and even greater autonomy to the Welsh and Scottish nations, perhaps even full independence. Though there was a lot of opposition to this notion with the common folk, Gleis hoped with his proceedings of Home Rule to establish a grounded base to gain political support over the coming months. The battle between the Emirates was still going on, ever so drenching the sands with blood of both people. And the same occurred in the war with Maclique in Mongolia. Though the front line had not shifted much, the results of attempted assaults were disastrous for Maclique. They had lost over 10,000 men already, whereas Tibet and Mongolia had not even lost a combined number of 1,000 yet. Time and time again were the charges by Maclique stumped by shredding machine gun fire from the heavily defended mountain regions. At the end of June, King Edward VIII officially opened the Queen Mary Way, the limited access highway connecting Toronto to Niagara Falls via Hamilton. Named for the Queen Mother, the QMW was the first limited access highway in North America. Next up, King Edward decided that stability needed to be brought back within Canada with the help of a dedicated radio broadcast commission. The CBC, a full-fledged radio network labeled the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, would help bring together a divided nation and limit the influence of potentially subversive foreign broadcasts. Besides stability, it would help King Edward to keep his political support as well. On the construction side of things, Edward greenlit a new excavation program to create better efficiency at gaining resources. At the end of July, the 5th Congress of the Socialist Republic of Italy ended with the Unione Nazionalista of Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, achieving a majority of seats in the government. The changing regime marked a turn of the Republic towards a more hardline and militaristic stance, particularly towards the Republic's enemies in the rest of Italy, who already reacted to the development with alarm. And then, word came out that Poland had elected a new king. For almost 2 decades, the Polish throne had remained empty. After the end of the Weltkrieg, A Regency Council was convened to elect the new Polish king. However, constant interference and ineptitude had prevented the council from selecting a king for all these years. But now, after many weeks of intense debate inside the chambers of the Polish Regency Council, the decision was finally made to elect a new monarch to the long-vacant Polish throne. The coronation of Karol Olbracht Habsburg-Lothringen was held in a palace at Warsaw early in the morning, and had been followed by parades and celebration throughout the nation. It remained to be seen whether the new king could navigate the small Polish nation through the coming times. The board was set, and the pieces were moving. It was the calm before the storm.